The text went to the wrong number. A Korean Mafia boss replied, "Dry your tears. I'm on my way." Mirabel's hands wouldn't stop shaking. She had been staring at them for the last 20 minutes, watching them tremble against the white lace of her gown, the way leaves shake before a storm. The floral embroidery on her sleeves blurred every time her eyes filled again. She kept blinking. She kept refusing to let the tears fall, because if she cried, really cried, then every single person sitting in those pews behind her would know that this was no longer a wedding. This was a funeral. 2 hours and 14 minutes. That's how long she had been sitting here. Not at the altar. She couldn't bear to stand there anymore, couldn't bear the pastor's expression of practiced sympathy. But in the front pew, her cathedral train pooled around her feet like a white tide that had nowhere left to go. The church was full. 200 people who had driven, flown, taken time off work, bought new outfits. 200 people who had watched her sit here for 2 hours and 14 minutes, waiting for a man named Vincent, who had apparently decided that she was not worth the drive. Her maid of honor, Priscilla, crouched beside her. Her voice was soft, careful, the way you speak to someone standing too close to an edge. "Mirabel, we need to go." "Not yet." "He's not." "I said not yet, Priscilla." The words came out harder than she intended. Priscilla flinched and pulled back. Mirabel closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose, where a headache had been building for the last hour like something being tightened with a wrench. Center of her chest, like a stone dropped. Center of her chest, like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples just kept moving outward, touching everything, changing the shape of everything. How long had he known? How long had he been planning this? When he kissed her goodbye last night, when he said, "I'll see you at the altar, beautiful," was he already gone? Her phone screen had gone dark. She turned it over in her hands once, twice, the way a person turns over a question they're afraid to answer. She'd already called Vincent 11 times. She'd already texted him 3 times. Nothing. Not even the small mercy of delivered receipts turning blue. And her brother David's contact was right there at the top of her recent calls. Big, steady, unshakable David, who had walked her through every crisis since she was 9 years old and had fallen out of a tree and was too scared to tell their mother. David, who always answered on the second ring. David who would come. David who would wrap her in his arms and walk her out of this church with her head held high and tell her this wasn't the end of her story. She opened a new message, typed with fingers that kept slipping. "David, I need you. I don't know what happened. He didn't come. I'm still here in my dress and everyone is watching and I can't make myself stand up. Please come get me. Please don't make me walk out of here alone." She didn't check the number. She just hit send. And then she pressed the phone against her chest and closed her eyes and prayed to every version of God she had ever believed in, that something, somewhere, would be kind to her today. The phone buzzed. Mirabel's heart cracked open with relief. She pulled the phone away from her chest so fast she nearly dropped it, her eyes flying to the screen. "Dry your tears, I'm already moving." She exhaled. A sound escaped her that was half laugh and half sob. He was coming. David was... The message continued. "Don't leave that church. I'll be there in 8 minutes. Stay exactly where you are." Mirabel blinked. David didn't talk like that. David said things like, "On my way, sis, and hold tight, and I got you." He didn't speak in directives. He didn't count down minutes. And he didn't sound like a command given by someone who had never once in their life been told no. Her fingers moved slowly. "David?" The reply was instantaneous. No, one word, clean as a cut. And Mirabel felt the ground shift beneath the pew. Then who is this? A pause. 3 seconds. 5. Long enough that she thought perhaps she had imagined the whole exchange. Someone who doesn't ignore a message like the one you just sent. 7 minutes now. Is the pastor still there? Mirabel looked up. The pastor stood near the altar, hands clasped, expression hovering somewhere between compassion and acute discomfort. Behind her, she could hear the guests. The whispering had started maybe 40 minutes ago, a low tide of murmured speculation that had grown steadily louder. She could feel their eyes on her back like a physical pressure. She typed without fully deciding to. Yes, he's still here. Good. 6 minutes. I need you to do something for me, Mirabel. She went very still. He knew her name. Her thumbs moved over the screen. How do you know my name? I know a great many things. I'll explain when I arrive. Right now, I need you to breathe. Sit up straight. Stop letting them see you breaking. Who are you? Someone who is going to walk through those doors in 5 minutes and need a bride standing at that altar, not sitting in a pew, standing, composed. The church air pressed in from every side. Mirabel read the message 3 times, convinced she was misunderstanding something, some crucial piece of context that would make this make sense. I think you have the wrong number. I have exactly the right number. 4 minutes. Here is what you need to understand. I require a wife before midnight to satisfy a legal inheritance clause that has existed in my family for 40 years. You require someone to walk you out of that church without destroying what remains of your dignity. This is not a coincidence. This is an arrangement. Mirabel's hands had gone completely numb. You're insane. Possibly. 3 minutes. But ask yourself this. What is your alternative? She looked up again. Her mother was in the 3rd row, and even from here, Mirabel could see the way her jaw was set, the way she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. Her father had his hand over his mouth. Her bridesmaids stood in a cluster near the side door, pastel dresses and uncertain faces, looking at each other instead of at her because none of them knew what to do, and looking at her felt too much like witnessing something private. 200 people who had come to see her begin her life, and she was sitting here in a white dress that suddenly felt like a costume for a role she had been written out of. She looked back at the screen. 2 minutes, Mirabel. Stand up. Walk to the altar. Let me give you something to stand on. Her legs moved before she made the decision. She stood. The cathedral train whispered across the tile floor, and she heard the shift in the room, a collective intake of breath, the whispers sharpening into attention, as she took the 3 steps to the altar and turned to face the doors. The pastor looked at her with naked surprise. "Miss Mirabel." "Please stay," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "Just, please stay." He stayed. The church doors opened, not gently, not the way the wedding coordinator had rehearsed it, with 2 ushers pulling them back in synchronized ceremony. They opened the way a statement is made, wide and sudden and absolute, pushed by 2 men in black suits whose posture alone communicated that they had never once in their lives been uncertain about anything. They flanked the entrance and didn't move again, statues in Italian wool. And then he walked in. Mirabel had prepared herself in the 3 seconds she'd had for someone alarming. What she had not prepared for was someone like this. He moved down the center aisle the way a man moves through a space that belongs to him by right of something older and more absolute than a deed or a title. His overcoat was black and heavy, tailored so precisely it seemed engineered rather than sewn, and it moved with him like a shadow that had decided to become solid. Beneath it, a black 3-piece suit, a dark tie perfectly knotted. He carried himself with the kind of stillness that isn't peace. It's the stillness of something that has already decided what it will do and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. His hair was dark, styled back from a face of sharp angles and absolute composure. His brow was slightly furrowed, not in confusion, but in the way of a man reading a situation and calculating it simultaneously. Behind him, 4 more men in identical black suits followed at precise intervals. They didn't look like groomsmen. They looked like the last thing some people ever saw. And he didn't stop until he was 3 feet from where Mirabel stood at the altar. He didn't acknowledge the silence that had replaced every whisper in the room, didn't look at the guests, didn't acknowledge the pastor's audible intake of breath. His eyes found hers and stayed there, dark, precise, and carrying a certainty that she found more terrifying than the absurdity of the moment. He knew she would still be standing here. He had known before he even walked through the door. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat, withdrew his phone, glanced at it once, then returned it without breaking her gaze. Then he extended his hand, steady, unhurried, as if he had done this before, or had always known he would do this here, in this church, with this woman in this dress. Mirabel. Not a question. And her name in his mouth landed like a claim being made in writing. I'm Seung Hoon. A pause, 1 breath long. I'm here to marry you. Somewhere in the back of the church, someone's phone camera flashed. One of her aunts made a sound. The pastor took a full step backward. Mirabel looked at the hand he was holding out to her. She looked at his face. There was no warmth in his eyes, no reassurance, no romantic overture dressed up in urgency. What lived in his expression was something far more unsettling. The calm of a man who had already run every version of this scenario and found only one outcome worth arriving for. He wasn't rescuing her. He was acquiring her. And in the worst part, the part that her hands already seemed to understand before her mind could catch up, was that she was standing in the ruins of a life she had built around a man who hadn't even bothered to tell her he was leaving. And this stranger, this cold, dangerous, immovable stranger, had driven across the city to be here. That had to mean something, even if she didn't yet know what. Her hand rose, trembling still. She hadn't stopped trembling since morning, but it rose. And when her fingers touched his closed around them without hesitation, cool, certain, absolute. Good, he said, low enough that only she could hear. Then he turned to face the pastor with an expression that didn't ask permission for anything. Continue. The groom has changed. Welcome to Ruthless Romance Tales. And darling, you just watched Mirabel place her hand in the palm of a man whose enemies don't get to tell the story of how they met him. Seung Hoon doesn't do rescues. He does acquisitions. And Mirabel, standing at that altar in her white lace gown with tears drying on her cheeks and a contract she hasn't read yet, she just became the most important asset in the most dangerous game this city has ever played. Vincent thought he could run. The Red Dragons think they've won, and Mirabel thinks this is the lowest point of her story. They're all wrong. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Mirabel knew this because she counted. Not the seconds, she wasn't that far gone, but the exchanges. The pastor's voice, stripped of all its rehearsed warmth and reduced to the bare legal minimum, moving through the vows with the efficiency of a man who had decided that the least he could do was finish quickly. Seung Hoon answered every question in a voice that didn't waver, didn't rush, didn't perform. He simply spoke, as if signing a document, as if this were a transaction being witnessed by God and 200 people who had stopped breathing somewhere around the moment he walked through the door. When it was Mirabel's turn, she heard her own voice from a distance, the way you hear yourself speak in a dream, present but slightly removed, like a signal with interference. I do. The ring Seung Hoon placed on her finger was not the one Vincent had chosen. It was not the delicate rose gold band she had picked out on a rainy Saturday afternoon 8 months ago, laughing over champagne at the jeweler's counter. This ring was a different thing entirely. Platinum, heavy. a single dark stone at its center that caught the church light and held it without giving anything back. She stared at it on her finger and felt, for one disorienting moment, as if it were looking at her. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." No one applauded. Someone cried. She thought it might be her mother, but she didn't turn around to check. She couldn't look at the faces behind her yet. She wasn't ready for what she would find there. The shock, the pity, the bewildered and hungry curiosity of people watching a woman they thought they knew make a decision that none of them could explain. Seung Hoon turned to her. His expression had not changed once in the past 11 minutes. "We leave now," he said. "Not shall we? Not are you ready? The bouquet from the pew, white peonies and bouquet from the pew, white peonies and eucalyptus, still perfect, still fragrant, absurdly untouched by everything that had happened." And she walked with him back down the center aisle. His hand was at the small of her back, barely touching, but the pressure of it was enough to keep her spine straight and her eyes forward. She felt the gauntlet of faces on either side of her like heat coming off pavement. She didn't look left. She didn't look right. She looked at the doors ahead, the rectangle of gray afternoon light growing larger with every step, and she told herself that whatever was waiting on the other side of those doors, she would figure it out. The alternative was stopping. And stopping was not something she could afford to do. The doors closed behind them. 3 black sedans sat at the curb, engines running. The men who had flanked the entrance were already outside, positioned at each vehicle with the quiet coordination of people who practiced this kind of thing. One of them opened the rear door of the center car without being asked. Seung Hoon guided Mirabel toward it with his hand still at her back, and she folded herself inside, cathedral train and all, and the door closed behind her with a sound like a vault being sealed. He got in beside her. The car moved before she had fully registered that she had left her own wedding. She sat with her bouquet in her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she watched the city slide past the tinted windows. The familiar street where the church stood. The bakery on the corner where she and Priscilla used to get coffee on Sunday mornings. The dry cleaner with the handwritten sign in the window. All of it unremarkable and unchanged, as if the world had not just reorganized itself around a new and terrifying axis. Seung Hoon was looking at his phone. The blue light of the screen reflected off the angles of his face in the dark interior of the car. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the church. He didn't seem to feel the silence as something requiring management. Mirabel stared at the ring on her finger. "I need to know," she said finally. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "What exactly just happened?" He didn't look up from the phone immediately. He finished reading whatever he was reading, then set the device face down on the seat between them. When he turned to look at her, and his expression was the same as it had been since the moment he walked through those church doors, composed, deliberate, revealing nothing that hadn't been decided in advance. "You got married," he said. "So did I." "That's not an explanation." "It's a fact. The explanation comes after you've had something to eat and changed out of that dress." He glanced at the gown briefly, the same way a person glances at a weather report, noting it, filing it, moving on. "You've been wearing it for 6 hours. You look like you're about to collapse." "I'm not." She stopped, reconsidered. She was, actually, exhausted in a way that had moved past feeling and become something structural, something in the bones. "Where are you taking me?" "My building." "And after that?" "We talk." She wanted to push harder, wanted the full architecture of what she had walked into, every room and corridor of it mapped and labeled before she took another step. But there was something in the quality of his attention, the way he had already returned to looking forward, already moved to the next thing. That told her this man would give her information on his own schedule, and that pressing him before he was ready would yield nothing except the frustrating experience of pressing against something immovable. So she turned back to the window, and she watched her city go by, and she tried very hard not to think about Vincent. She failed. He surfaced in her mind the way he always had, easy, familiar, with that half smile that she had once thought meant he was always slightly amused by how lucky he was. She thought about the last morning she had seen him, and the way he had kissed her forehead before she left for her hair appointment, the smell of his coffee breath, the way he'd said, "See you at the altar," beautiful as if it were the most ordinary promise in the world, a promise so ordinary it required no effort to keep. She had believed him. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window and let the city take the thought away. The building was not what she had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. Something that announced itself, perhaps, something with visible teeth. Instead, it was a tower of dark glass rising quietly above the financial district, the kind of building that doesn't need to prove anything because everything about its dimensions already has. And the lobby was marble in low light, and the particular silence of a place where sound goes to become something more respectful of itself. People moved aside as Seung Hoon walked through, not conspicuously. No one stopped, no one stared, but there was a current of adjustment, a subtle reorientation of bodies and trajectories, the way water moves around something that has entered it. Mirabel noticed it and filed it away. The elevator opened before he pressed the button. He lived on the 43rd floor. The doors opened directly into the apartment. No hallway, no threshold to cross. Just the elevator releasing you into a space that took Mirabel's breath away with the efficiency of a fact being stated. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, the city below them lit and moving and entirely unaware of how high above it she was standing. Walls that she didn't have the vocabulary to describe but understood instinctively as expensive and deliberately cold. The kitchen, visible beyond a low partition, was immaculate in a way that suggested it was not primarily used for cooking. Everything in the space was perfect. Everything in the space was hard. A woman appeared from somewhere, mid-50s, hair pulled back, expression of absolute professional neutrality, and spoke to Seung Hoon in Korean. He replied briefly, and the woman turned to Mirabel. "I'll show you to your room," she said. Her English was precise. "There are clothes. Mr. Seung Hoon had some things arranged." Mirabel looked at him. "Well, you had clothes arranged." "I had a guest room prepared. The clothing is practical. Nothing was chosen for sentiment." She wanted to ask how long he had been planning this. She wanted to know exactly what arranged meant and when it had started and how many steps ahead of her he had been before she'd even sat down in that pew. But the exhaustion had reached her in a new way, now that she was standing still, and the woman was already moving, and Mirabel's feet, apparently, had made a decision her mind hadn't fully ratified. She followed. The guest room was larger than her apartment's living room and looked out over a different quadrant of the city, the western face of it, where the sun was finishing its descent behind the skyline in shades of amber and bruised purple. One of the clothes that had been arranged were folded on a chair near the window. Dark trousers, a simple blouse, slippers, underwear still in packaging. Practical, impersonal, exactly what he'd said. She stood under the shower for a long time and let the water run hot enough to hurt and didn't think about anything. This was a skill she had developed at 23 during a different crisis, and she had never been more grateful for it than right now. When she came out, dressed, hair damp against her shoulders, she found a tray on the low table by the window. Soup, bread, water. No one had knocked. No one had announced it. It had simply appeared the way things appeared to appear in this place, without ceremony, without asking permission, as a fact rather than an offer. She ate because her body demanded it, and then she went to find him. And he was standing at the main window when she came back into the living room, hands in the pockets of his trousers, jacket discarded somewhere, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms. He was looking at the city the way a person looks at something they own, not with greed exactly, but with the settled familiarity of long possession. He heard her come in, didn't turn around for a moment, then, "Better? I have questions." "I know." He turned then and gestured toward the seating area, 2 chairs and a low table, a document sitting in the center of it like something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment. "Sit. I'll explain everything once. Ask what you need after." She sat. He sat across from her, and for the first time since the church, knew she had the chance to look at him without the distraction of 200 witnesses and the wreckage of her own wedding day pressing in from every direction. He was younger than she'd first thought, mid-30s perhaps. The severity of his bearing had initially read as age, but it wasn't age. It was something else. Discipline that had been running for so long it had become structure. He told her what he was in the same tone one might use to describe a profession, without drama, without the weight of disclosure. The Seung family, 3 generations, import, export, and the other things that moved alongside, legitimate commerce in the dark, in the margins, in the spaces between what was legal and what was necessary. He was the 3rd head of the family business. He had been for 6 years. He told her about the clause, 40 years old, written by his grandfather into the family succession documents, requiring that the heir be married before the age of 36 in order to maintain control of the family's legal holdings, the legitimate holdings, the buildings, the companies, the investments that formed the clean surface of an empire whose foundations were considerably less clean. He turned 36 in 31 days. "Every arrangement I made before this collapsed," he said. "It was not a confession. It was a data point. The women involved made decisions I couldn't accommodate." "They ran," Mirabel said. Something moved in his expression. The closest thing to acknowledgement she had seen from him. "They ran," he agreed. She looked at the document on the table. "And this?" "A contract, terms of the arrangement between us. What I provide. What you agree to." She pulled it toward her and read it. He let her read without interrupting, without watching her with any visible impatience. He simply sat, hands relaxed on his knees, letting her take the time she needed. This, she would later think, was one of the first things she noticed about him that didn't fit the architecture of what he was. He gave her time, not warmth, not reassurance, but time. And that was its own kind of respect. The contract was thorough. Her debts, and she had some student loans and a credit line that Vincent had, she now understood, been supposed to help her with, cleared within 30 days. An apartment of her own, separate from this one, if she wanted it. A monthly allowance that made her breath catch. Full access to legal counsel. On a clause that she had the right to terminate the agreement after 1 year if certain conditions were met. And what he required in return, her presence at events he designated, her name on his marriage certificate, and her silence about the nature of their arrangement. It did not say she had to love him. It did not say she had to stay in this apartment. It did not say anything about what happened if she did. She set the last page down. "You said the wrong number wasn't entirely wrong," she said. "Your people knew about me." The pause before he answered was a fraction of a second too long. "My team monitors certain social circles for potential candidates. Your profile fit the criteria." So this was planned. The identification was planned. Your decision to send that message was yours. I don't control accidents, Mirabel, and I use them. She sat with that for a moment, turned the pen over in her fingers. The thing was, and this was the part she could not tell him, not yet, possibly not ever. She was not as surprised as she should have been. Not because she had expected any of this, but because the life she had been building with Vincent had been constructed. She now understood, on ground that was never solid. She had sensed it, in the way you sense a crack in a wall before you can see it. She had sanded over it with planning and optimism and 8 months of flower choices and cake tastings and dress fittings. And now the wall was down and she was sitting across from a man who collected dangerous things for a living and had decided with the same systematic precision he applied to everything to collect her. She signed the contract, and he watched her do it without any visible reaction. Then he took the document, countersigned it, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket, which had appeared from somewhere during their conversation. "My lawyer will send you copies by morning," he said. "The guest room is yours for as long as the arrangement requires. There are security protocols you'll need to learn. Someone will go through them with you tomorrow." "What kind of security protocols?" "The kind that keep you alive in my world." He said it without drama. That was the most frightening part, the absence of performance. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He was simply telling her the truth of her new geography. "Get some rest," he said, standing. "You've had a long day." She almost laughed. Almost. And then the first week moved like something that hadn't fully decided what it was yet. Mirabel learned the rhythms of the apartment the way you learn the rhythms of a country whose language you don't yet speak. By observation, by careful attention, by making small errors and noting what they cost you. She learned that Seung Hoon rose before 5, that he ate breakfast standing at the kitchen counter, always the same things, and was on calls before 6, that there were men in the building she should not address directly, that certain rooms she was not to enter without cause, including his study and a room on the north side of the floor, whose purpose she had not yet determined and whose door was always closed. And she learned that the apartment was not the same thing as a prison and was not the same thing as a home and existed in some third category she didn't have a name for. She could leave. She did leave. To the gym on the 38th floor, to the small cafe on the street level that she discovered on the second day, once, cautiously, to the bookshop 3 blocks away. But there was always someone nearby. Not intrusive, not visible in any obvious way, just present in the manner of weather. A man reading a newspaper at the cafe counter who closed his paper and left when she left. A car that always seemed to be available. A phone that had been placed on her dresser with certain numbers already programmed, including one that simply read security and another that read SH. She hadn't called the second one yet. She also learned that Seung Hoon worked with an intensity that didn't acknowledge days of the week. She saw him at breakfast, occasionally at dinner if their schedules aligned, and sometimes, passing the study late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would see the line of light under the door and understand that the man inside was not someone who required darkness to rest, because he barely rested at all. He was not unkind to her. She noted this carefully because she had expected something else. Not cruelty, exactly, but the cool indifference of someone who had acquired a thing and filed it away. Instead, there were small recognitions. Her coffee preference noted once and never mentioned again, but present every morning. A book on her dresser one afternoon. No note, to no explanation, on the history of a period she had mentioned in passing during one of their few conversations, offhand as background color to something else she was saying, a detail, the kind of thing that required listening. She found she could not decide what to do with a man who listened but showed nothing. On the 9th day, he knocked on her door at 7 in the morning. "Get dressed," he said when she opened it. She'd been awake for an hour, reading. Something practical. Not that. His eyes moved briefly to the soft sweater she was wearing and returned to her face. "We're going out." "Where?" "The lower districts. I have a meeting. You'll observe." She dressed, dark trousers, and a structured jacket from among the things that had been added to the guest room wardrobe with the same absence of announcement as everything else in this apartment. Flat shoes. She pulled her hair back and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The ring still on her finger, catching the light, and then went to find him. The meeting was in a restaurant that wasn't open for service yet. Chairs still upturned on tables, the smell of the previous night's cooking still in the walls. 4 men sat at a corner table. They rose when Seung Hoon entered, not with the performance of ceremony, but with the reflex of something that had been trained deep. He sat. She sat beside him. He did not introduce her. He did not explain her presence. She understood, after a few minutes of watching, that she was not expected to speak and that her presence itself was the statement. That she was there, that she was known to be his, that this information was being received and would travel. She sat very still and watched the exchange with her hands folded in her lap, and she paid attention to everything, the way the men positioned themselves, the language of deference in the angles of their shoulders, the one man at the far end of the table who deferred a fraction of a second slower than the others and whose eyes moved to Mirabel twice more than they should have. On the way back in the car, Seung Hoon looked at his phone for the first 2 minutes. Then, without looking up, "What did you notice?" she told him. "The deference patterns. The man at the end of the table. And the way the conversation's speed changed when certain topics were approached." He set the phone down, looked at her with something she hadn't seen before in his expression, attention of a different quality, not the cool appraisal of the first days, something more considered. "The man at the end," he said, "his name is Choi. You're right about him. Most people don't see it in the first meeting." "What will you do about it?" "What I always do." He didn't elaborate. She didn't ask him to. The lessons became a pattern after that. Not scheduled, not announced, never framed as instruction, simply offered in the structure of days that began to move differently. A meeting she would attend, a conversation he would include her in at the periphery without pressure, watching what she absorbed. He would tell her things afterward, not everything, all but pieces, enough to build a partial map of the world she was standing in, enough that the geography began, slowly, to have features she could name. He taught her how to read a room, how to identify who held real authority versus performed authority, how to move through a space in his company, not behind him, not beside him, in a way that invited conversation, but slightly back and to his left, visible enough to register, restrained enough not to distract. He taught her what silence meant in negotiations and how to distinguish the silence of agreement from the silence of resistance. She was a fast student. This seemed to surprise him, though he didn't say so directly. She saw it instead in the incremental changes of how he briefed her before they went somewhere, the information becoming more specific, more complete, the gaps filling in. And she was beginning to understand the grammar of his world, and she was beginning, uncomfortably, to understand him. 14 days after the wedding, she came into the main room to find him in conversation with a man she hadn't seen before. Younger than Seung Hoon, well-dressed, the ease of someone accustomed to the proximity of power without being its center. He was showing Seung Hoon something on a tablet, and they were speaking in Korean. She crossed to the kitchen to make coffee, giving them the space of the room. She was standing at the counter when she felt the shift in the air. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in barometric pressure. She looked up. Seung Hoon's eyes had moved from the tablet to her. The man beside him was still talking, but Seung Hoon had stopped listening in the functional sense. I was instead watching her with an expression that was doing something she hadn't cataloged before in his repertoire, something tight around the edges, something that was evaluating not a situation but a feeling, and finding the feeling unwelcome. The younger man followed Seung Hoon's gaze to Mirabel. He smiled at her. It was a perfectly ordinary smile, the uncomplicated kind that people deploy in rooms where they want to communicate that they are not a threat. Seung Hoon said something in Korean, short and flat. The man's smile disappeared. He returned his attention to the tablet. The meeting concluded 4 minutes later. The man left. Seung Hoon stood in the center of the room in the particular way he stood when he was processing something and choosing what to do with it. Then he walked to the kitchen. He stood on the other side of the counter from her. "Who is he?" she asked, because she had learned to ask directly rather than wait. "Someone who works for a partner of mine. His name isn't important." He seemed harmless. "He smiled at you." She looked at him. "People smile at me. It's a fairly standard human behavior. In my world, it's a communication." And what was he communicating? He held her gaze for a moment, 2-3 seconds longer than was necessary for a man whose expressions revealed nothing. And in those extra seconds, something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for yet, something that looked almost like the earliest possible stage of a man becoming uncertain about his own certainty. "He was noting," Seung Hoon said finally, "that you are here, that you are accessible, and that the terms of your accessibility are not yet understood by everyone who might want to understand them. And is that a problem? I don't allow it to become one." She poured her coffee, held the mug with both hands, and watched him over the rim. "That," she said quietly, "sounded like jealousy." He said nothing. He turned and walked back toward the study, and she heard the door close with its usual soundless precision. But she had seen his jaw tighten before he turned away, and she filed it carefully in the growing catalog of things she was learning about the architecture of Seung Hoon as something worth remembering. The message came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the wedding, while Mirabel was sitting in the window seat of the guest room watching rain move across the city in gray sheets. An unknown number, 8 words. I need you to know I didn't choose this." She stared at it for a long time. Then she typed, "Vincent." The reply came before she could set the phone down. "They took me the night before. I couldn't warn you. I couldn't contact anyone. They only just let me use a phone. Mirabel, I am so sorry. I need to see you. Please, don't tell anyone where you're going, especially not him." She read it 4 times. She read it the way you read something you want to be true, badly enough that you're willing to audit your own instincts to get there. Vincent, who had kissed her forehead and said, "See you at the altar." Vincent, who had been her person for 3 years, whose laugh she knew, whose fears she knew, whose coffee order and childhood memories and habit of leaving cabinet doors open she knew. She read it a 5th time. And then she thought about the man whose study light burned past midnight, who had put a book on her dresser without a word, who had watched another man smile at her and found it intolerable without knowing how to say so. She thought about the contract sitting in a lawyer's office with both their signatures on it. She wrote back, when and where. She almost told him. This was the thing she would return to afterward, turning it in her hands like something with an edge she hadn't found yet. She almost knocked on the study door that evening, almost laid the phone on the desk between them and said, "Look at this. Tell me what it means." But Vincent's message was there. Don't tell anyone, especially not him. And beneath it, something older and more stubborn than logic. The part of her that had loved Vincent for 3 years and needed, well, before she closed that door completely, to look him in the face. So she went alone. The cafe he named was in the Western Quarter, 40 minutes by subway, the kind of neighborhood where the streets were narrow and the foot traffic thick enough to disappear into. She left in the mid-afternoon, told the woman who managed the apartment that she was going to the bookshop, wore a coat she hadn't worn before, and left her security phone on the dresser, and took only the old one, the personal one, the one that had sent the wrong text on the worst day of her life. She found a corner table, ordered tea she didn't drink, watched the door. Vincent walked in 22 minutes late. He looked the way his description in her own mind had always said he would look, the way Seung Hoon had looked the first time, and somehow hadn't, smaller. He had lost weight. His jacket was wrong for the weather, his eyes moving too quickly around the room, that particular restlessness of a man who has been afraid for long enough that fear has become his resting state. He saw her, and something crossed his face that might have been relief or might have been the performance of it. She had not until this moment understood that she would not be able to tell the difference. He sat across from her and reached for her hands. She let him take them. "You're okay," he said. "God, you're okay." "I'm fine." She kept her voice level. "Tell me what happened." He told her. A story with the architecture of truth and the texture of something rehearsed. Men who had come to the hotel the night before the wedding. A debt, a threat, a choice made under duress to protect her. He said protect her twice. And he said he'd had no options. He said the people who'd taken him were connected to dangerous networks she didn't understand. That she needed to come with him now, quietly. That the man she was living with was not safe. That she had walked into something she didn't fully. "How did you know," she said, "where I was living?" He stopped. The pause was perhaps 1 second long, but she had spent 3 weeks learning to read pauses from a man who deployed them like instruments, and 1 second was more than enough. People talk. I heard, Vincent." He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and she let him see that she was not the woman who had sat in that pew for 2 hours and 14 minutes. That woman had still believed that the worst thing that could happen to you was being left. She had learned in the past 3 weeks, or that there were considerably worse things, and that knowing the difference was its own kind of survival. "How much did they pay you?" she said, "for the wedding information?" His face changed. Not all at once. It moved through several intermediate stages, denial and recalibration, and the particular collapse of a person whose story has been refused. And then he dropped it entirely, and what was left underneath was something she found she didn't recognize. Not the man she had built 3 years around, just a person who had made a series of calculations and was now arriving at the bill. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he said. "It never is." He was still talking. Excuses restructuring themselves into explanations. The explanations reaching for justification. When the cafe door opened and the temperature of the room changed in the way she had learned, over 3 weeks, to recognize as the arrival of Seung Hoon. He didn't look at her first. He looked at Vincent. And the quality of that look was something she felt in the floor beneath her feet. 2 men came in behind him and stationed themselves at the door without being asked. Seung Hoon crossed the room and stopped at their table and stood there, and Vincent went completely still, the way small animals go, still when something much larger enters their field. "Mrs. Seung," he said, and she understood that he was speaking to her even though he hadn't taken his eyes off Vincent. His voice was the temperature of the rain outside. "Go to the car." "I'm not." "Go to the car. Mirabel." And then he did look at her, one brief rotation of his gaze, and what she saw in his face was not anger, not the hot reactive kind, but something far more controlled and therefore far more frightening. The look of a man who has already decided what is going to happen and is simply waiting for the room to be arranged correctly. She went to the car. She sat in the back seat for 11 minutes. She counted again, the way she had counted at the altar, because counting gave the mind something to do that wasn't imagining. When Seung Hoon came out and got in beside her, his expression was returned to its customary architecture, composed, deliberate. She looked at his hands and saw nothing but the ring on his finger and the faint tension in the line of his jaw. "Is he alive?" Seung Hoon said, and aware now, of the cost of what he sold. She nodded. She did not ask for specifics. She wasn't sure she wanted them, and she was increasingly sure that he would not provide them regardless. Some rooms in his world she was learning to identify by their doors, and choose not to enter. They drove in silence for several minutes. "You knew he would contact me," she said. "I suspected. You followed me. I had someone watch your building. When you left without the security phone, I was informed." A pause. "I don't surveil you, Mirabel, but I surveil the people who might use you." She considered the distinction, filed it in the catalog. "He was going to sell me again," she said. Not a question. "To a rival network. Yes." She looked out the window. The rain was heavier now. The city fractured and reassembled through the water on the glass. "And the wrong number. Your intelligence team had flagged me." "Yes. So you used me too." The silence that followed was the kind he didn't fill immediately, and she had learned to understand that this kind meant he was not dismissing the statement, but measuring it. "Yes," he said. "In the beginning." She turned to look at him. He was looking forward at the back of the driver's headrest, and his jaw was doing the thing it did when he was experiencing something he hadn't yet determined how to accommodate. "And now?" she said. He said nothing. The car moved through the wet city. She turned back to the window. The call came 6 days later, a message to her personal phone, the wrong number phone, containing a photograph. Vincent, zip-tied to a chair in a concrete room, face swollen, a placard hung around his neck with a location and a time and 3 words: "Bring the wife." She stood in the hallway outside the study with the phone in her hand and knocked on the door and went in without waiting to be told, which she had never done before, and laid the phone on the desk in front of him without speaking. He looked at the photograph for 4 seconds. Then he picked up his own phone. "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "I know what you're going to do," she said, "and I know you're going to tell me to stay here. I'm telling you now that I won't. He was my fiancé for 3 years, and he has betrayed me twice, and I want to be there when it ends. I want to see the last of it with my own eyes." Something moved through his face. She had become, over the past weeks, a more precise reader of its terrain, could identify now the difference between the stillness of control and the stillness of something being held. This was the second kind. "The docks are not—" "I know what the docks are. Take me anyway." 3 seconds. 4. "Stay behind me," he said, "at all times. If I tell you to move, you move without asking why." "Agreed. And you don't speak to anyone but me." "Agreed." He stood, and she saw him become, in a span of seconds, a different arrangement of the same man. The domesticated authority of the apartment shed like a coat, replaced by something older and more absolute. He made 2 calls. He put on his jacket. He looked at her once, assessingly, the way he had looked at her the first morning in the church, calculating what she was made of, and then he walked to the door. She followed, and the docks were black water and sodium light and the smell of brine and diesel, and they were not empty. The Red Dragons had arranged their people with the confidence of those who had done this before, who believed the location and the leverage were sufficient. They had brought 8 men. They had Vincent in the center of the space, still in the chair, more damaged now than the photograph had shown. They had a man at the door who held it open when he saw what was coming through it. Seung Hoon had brought 14. It was over before it reached the worst version of itself. This was something she understood only later, sitting in the car with her hands very still in her lap, that the violence she had witnessed was the contained kind, the kind that has been thoroughly planned, and that the chaos she'd experienced, as terrifying was, from Seung Hoon's perspective, a controlled sequence reaching its designated conclusion. She had stayed behind him. When he told her to move, she moved. When the noise was at its worst, she kept her eyes open because she had decided in the car on the way here that she was not someone who looked away from the truth of the life she was standing in. Vincent, cut loose from the chair, looked at her across the warehouse floor with the eyes of a man who understood he was receiving a mercy he had not earned. She looked back at him and felt, not forgiveness, not yet, possibly not ever, but the clean finality of a door that has been properly closed rather than left to bang in the wind. "Take him," Seung Hoon told one of his men, "to the hospital, then out of the city." He came to stand beside her. Then they stood together in the wreckage of the thing that Vincent had built and burned, and she studied the floor and the walls and the sodium light above them, and understood that this was the last room of the old story. Everything after this was something else. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." He nodded. They walked out together into the night air, and the black water moved against the pilings in the dark, and she breathed in the cold of it and felt, strangely and for the first time in a long time, the solid ground beneath her feet. She asked him for the contract 3 days later. He looked up from his desk without surprise, as if he had been expecting the request and had only been uncertain of the timing. He opened the drawer to his left and placed it on the desk between them, all 10 pages of it. Yeah, their signatures at the bottom of the last one. She picked it up, held it for a moment. Then she went to the fireplace in the main room, the one that was always laid but never lit, aesthetic and cold, and she lit it, and she fed the contract into it a few pages at a time, and she watched the paper take the flame with the unhurried attention of someone who knows that certain endings require witnessing. Seung Hoon stood in the doorway behind her. She heard him cross the room and stop, close enough that she could have leaned back and found him there. "The clause," she said, watching the last page curl and blacken. "Your inheritance. The deadline is in 8 days. Yes. You're still married. Yes. The contract is gone. Yes." She turned around. He was closer than she'd calculated, which meant she had to look up slightly to find his face. And his expression was doing the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency over the past weeks, the thing that looked like a man confronting the limits of what control can accomplish. "I'm staying," she said. "Not because of the clause, not because of the arrangement, because I'm choosing to." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not dramatically. This was not a man built for drama. But it shifted, and she felt it the way you feel a change in pressure, the way weather announces itself before it arrives. "You understand what that means," he said. "What this life is." "I've been living in it for a month. I understand it better than most people you could have married." "It doesn't get easier." "I'm not looking for easier." She held his gaze. "I'm looking for real." He was quiet for long enough that the fire behind her had settled into steadier burning. Then he reached out and took her hand, not the way he had in the church, not the cool transaction of a claim being made, but differently, with something that had learned itself in the space of 31 days, and a warehouse, and a dozen small moments that had accumulated into weight. "Then stay," he said. She looked at the ring on her finger, the dark stone, the one that didn't give the light back. She was beginning to understand that some things hold the light rather than reflect it, that this isn't the same as darkness. She kept it on,